Washington, early 1980s. A man stands in front of the White House with a little boy. Father and son. They pose for a photo like ordinary tourists. The father wears a checkered shirt and a thick mustache. Next to him stands his young son, Juan Pablo, on what would become the first great trip of his life. At first glance, there's nothing unusual about them. Just another pair among the thousands of visitors who come to the U.S. Capitol every day. But this father is Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, the future cocaine kingpin who would soon flood America with white powder and chaos. That photo in front of the White House became a symbol of irony, a tourist smiling in front of the most powerful building in the world, who would later become America's #1 enemy. This chapter of Escobar's story is rarely told. We usually hear about the Medellin bombings, his war with the Colombian state, or his violent death on a rooftop. But before that war began, before the world knew the name El Patron, Pablo Escobar had already been to the United States under his own name as a tourist, businessman, smuggler, and family man. He walked the streets of Miami, New York, Los Angeles, and Washington. He bought cars, electronics, even took his family to Disneyland. This is the story of those visits, moments that reveal how a man from Medellin first met America, first as a visitor and consumer, and later as its most wanted enemy. The 1970s were the years when Pablo Escobar was still climbing his way up. In Medellin, he was known as a smuggler of cigarettes, whiskey, and electronics. He dealt in car theft, extortion, and eventually, his first small shipments of cocaine. Miami became his door to the world. Just a few hours by plane from Colombia, the city was a magnet for Latin Americans chasing the American dream. For Escobar, it was the perfect destination. At first, he traveled legally. He bought plane tickets under his real name, landed in Miami, and walked into the United States with no questions asked. Officially, he was just a businessman from Medellin. In reality, he was studying the market, making contacts, learning how America worked, and bringing back to Colombia the symbols of Western luxury: American electronics and appliances, car parts and accessories, motorcycles and sports cars. There's an anecdote that captures that time perfectly. Escobar would walk into dealerships and pay cash for entire cars, Mustangs, Chevrolets, even shiny Cadillacs. He shipped them back to Colombia by boat, where they became a spectacle of wealth and success. For his friends in Medellin, Pablo was already someone special, a man who could bring pieces of America to Colombia. It built his prestige and aura long before anyone called him the king of cocaine. Back then, Miami was only beginning to transform into the future capital of the cocaine trade. In the mid-70s, it was still a sunny, growing city, and Escobar was just another Latino with too much cash to spend. Pablo at the controls. But Pablo wasn't always just a passenger. He loved airplanes. From a young age, he learned to fly small aircraft, Cessnas and Pipers. In those early years, he sometimes sat behind the controls himself and flew directly to Miami. He would land in Florida not only as a tourist but also as a pilot, carrying cash and car parts. Those were still the romantic days of smuggling, a few suitcases of dollars, sometimes the first kilos of cocaine hidden among the luggage. Escobar lived for risk. He loved telling stories later in life. I flew to the U.S. myself with the goods, and no one stopped me. That's how his legend began, the legend of a man who believed he could outsmart an entire empire. Escobar beyond Miami, the learning years. Escobar didn't limit himself to Miami. He also traveled to other American cities, New York and Los Angeles. In New York, the drug scene at the time was already divided and fiercely competitive. The trade was dominated by Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and Dominicans. The Colombians, new players in the game, were just beginning to find their footing. They didn't yet have a structure, a network, or the muscle to compete. Escobar came to New York to observe, to learn, and to make connections. He wasn't yet the feared patron of Medellin. He was a curious entrepreneur, a man trying to understand how the American underworld worked. The same story unfolded on the West Coast. In California, especially in Los Angeles, the opportunities seemed endless. A massive Latino community, a booming drug market, and close proximity to Mexico made it a tempting target. But Escobar quickly realized the truth. The Medellin cartel could never take over the U.S. directly. The competition was too strong. Cubans and Dominicans already had their own routes, while Mexican traffickers controlled everything along the southern border. So the Colombians changed strategy. Instead of trying to rule the streets of New York or Los Angeles, they would control the supply. They focused on the entry points, especially Florida, where others would handle the local distribution. Escobar's men would deliver the cocaine, and Medellin would count the profits. That was his genius. He understood that in the United States, he would never be the king of the streets, but he could become the king of export. The most iconic visit, Escobar in Washington, D.C. Among all of Pablo Escobar's trips to the United States, one stands above the rest, his visit to Washington, D.C. It was during that trip that the now famous photograph was taken, Escobar standing in front of the White House with his young son, Juan Pablo. For an ordinary tourist, it would have been just another vacation snapshot, but for history, it became a symbol of pure irony. Only a few years later, U.S. presidents would call him America's most dangerous enemy. The DEA would spend hundreds of millions of dollars hunting him across 2 continents. Yet at that moment, no one noticed him. No one cared. He was just another man with a mustache, posing with his son in front of the president's home. Pablo acted like a regular father, buying souvenirs, showing his boy the streets of the world's most powerful capital. Years later, his son would recall how peaceful and happy his father looked that day, as if he truly believed this was just a normal family vacation. That photo has since appeared in countless documentaries and news pieces, because it perfectly captures the transformation of his story, from anonymous tourist to America's ultimate nightmare. Escobar in Disney World, but Escobar didn't stop in Washington. On that same trip, he took his family to Disney World in Florida. He was there with his wife Maria Victoria, his son Juan Pablo, and his little daughter Manuela. For the children, it was a dream come true. 2 kids from the streets of Medellin, suddenly surrounded by the colors and magic of Disney. Parades, rides, cartoon characters. For them, it was a shock of joy and wonder. Maria later recalled how different Pablo seemed during those days. He smiled constantly, bought his kids toys and ice cream, took endless photos. For a few days, he looked like a man who had everything, a happy husband, a proud father. But inside his pocket, he already carried a plan to turn cocaine into a billion-dollar empire. That contrast, the Escobar family enjoying Disney World, and the father who would soon become Colombia's most feared terrorist, remains one of the most haunting images of his double life. Miami, Escobar's second home. For Pablo Escobar, Miami was more than just a destination. It was his second home, even though he never officially lived there. It was in Miami that he bought cars, motorcycles, and spare parts. It was there that he met the smugglers and pilots who would later become the backbone of his cocaine fleet. And it was there that he enjoyed life's temptations, nightclubs, casinos, and luxurious restaurants. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Miami exploded with cocaine money. What had once been a sleepy retirement city turned into a neon paradise of gangsters, cash, and excess. Escobar didn't just enjoy that new Miami, he helped create it. He would walk into car dealerships, pull out wads of cash, and buy Ferraris and Cadillacs outright. He did business with middlemen who would later distribute Medellin's cocaine across the American market. Miami was perfect for him, close to Colombia, filled with Latino networks, and greased by corrupt officials willing to look the other way. A salesman in a Ferrari dealership watches a Colombian man open a suitcase full of dollars. He doesn't ask where the money came from, He only asks, "What color do you want?" The DEA incident. But life in Miami wasn't always that carefree. Even before his name appeared on any blacklist, Escobar had his first run-in with U.S. authorities. At Miami International Airport, customs officers stopped him for inspection. He was carrying an unusually large amount of cash. According to later accounts, he had a suitcase full of dollars and couldn't provide a convincing explanation. He was taken into a small interrogation room, but Pablo stayed calm and confident. He told them he was a businessman, that he bought cars and electronics in America, and that he preferred to keep his money on him because he didn't trust banks. The agents let him go. At that time, the name Pablo Escobar meant nothing to anyone in the U.S. He slipped through their fingers, a ghost they didn't yet know to fear. It was a close call, one that could have changed everything if the DEA had known more. But they didn't. And when Pablo returned to Colombia, he already understood something crucial. His days in the United States were numbered. The officially confirmed trips of Pablo Escobar to the United States include Miami, Washington, D.C., and several visits to New York and Los Angeles. But around those real journeys, an entire mythology took shape, a web of stories, rumors, and half-truths. Some are impossible to verify. Others come from the testimonies of his former pilots and business partners. Together, they form the shadow map of Escobar's America, Las Vegas, the cocaine king in the city of chance. According to one enduring story, Escobar also visited Las Vegas. It was the late 1970s when Nevada was entering the golden age of casinos and neon-lit luxury. Escobar, always fascinated by wealth, risk, and spectacle, was said to have spent several days in the city, gambling at roulette tables and observing how Americans turned greed into entertainment. Is it true? Probably not. There are no photos, documents, or official records. But the tale lives on because it fits perfectly with the legend of Pablo Escobar, a man addicted not only to cocaine, but to the thrill of excess. California, Los Angeles, and San Diego. Escobar's presence in Los Angeles is widely accepted. But there are also persistent rumors that he visited San Diego and even San Francisco. His associates later claimed he was studying the West Coast drug market and scouting potential smuggling routes through California's ports. In San Diego, he allegedly met with traffickers who managed the Mexican border routes. In San Francisco, he was said to have been intrigued by the hippie counterculture and its growing appetite for drugs. Again, no evidence, no photographs. But the stories were repeated so often by those who knew him that they became part of his unofficial biography. Chicago, myth or reality? Some accounts even place Escobar in Chicago, the legendary city of Al Capone, still synonymous with organized crime in America. According to these claims, Escobar met with intermediaries linked to local mafia circles, exploring the idea of supplying cocaine to Midwestern networks. Did he really go to Chicago? No one knows for sure. But the fact that such stories exist reveals how deeply the myth of Escobar penetrated American imagination. To many, it seemed inevitable that the world's most notorious drug lord had, at least once, walked through every corner of the United States. But that peaceful chapter couldn't last forever. By the late 1970s, the name Pablo Escobar began to appear in DEA reports. American agents had started noticing that Colombians were becoming key players in the booming cocaine trade. By 1979, after a series of massive cocaine seizures and as the Medellin cartel became increasingly tied to violence, Escobar's name was officially added to U.S. watch lists. From that moment on, he could no longer enter the United States legally. His time as a tourist, shopper, and father visiting Disneyland was over. From then on, his presence in America would only be indirect, through pilots, smugglers, and middlemen who carried out his empire's work. Pablo Escobar would never again set foot on American soil. The story of Escobar's U.S. visits. A tale of paradoxes. A simple tourist posing in front of the White House. A father taking his family to theme parks. A businessman buying cars and electronics in Miami. And yet, that same man would soon become America's greatest nightmare. He would flood the United States with tons of cocaine, ignite the Miami drug crisis, and trigger an era of violence that would reshape the entire hemisphere. That photo in front of the White House remains a symbol of irony, a quiet moment that captures the contradiction of his life. Because the man standing calmly as a tourist in the heart of Washington would, just a few years later, become the #1 target of the U.S. government, Pablo Escobar, the Colombian who once visited America before declaring war on it.